During the past several weeks, we've talked a lot about the love of God. We've been in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, going through various passages, studying a lot about what took place in the days of Moses, right before they came out of Egypt, when they came out of Egypt, as they come to Mount Sinai. And I was going to continue in a different sermon this week, but sometimes things come up, or somebody might ask a question, somebody might have something that they want to know about, and I will deviate a little bit. And so last week we had come to the commandments in Exodus chapter 20, and we read through the 10 commandments, and we looked back before the commandments to see if the commandments, of all 10 of them, existed before Sinai. And in going through that, it was nice because Brother Roy made a suggestion of a sermon, which I hope to do next week, or at least in the coming weeks. I will try to address that, which goes nicely with what we talked about last week, about the 10 Commandments existing before Sinai. And in that sermon, I made a comment, and I've said this before, but it came to my attention that I've made this comment without any proof. And the comment was that Job existed before this time. In other words, did Job exist before the time of Moses? Did Job exist during the time of Moses? Was the book of Job written before or after the time of Sinai? What was the story behind all of this? And some people have said that there's no biblical proof. Well, we're going to open our Bibles today, and we're going to see biblical proof of the statement that I made, just to support that from the Bible so that there's no question in anyone's mind. And some might look at this and they might say, well, that's not evidence enough. But it'll be interesting to see as we go through what your thoughts are and what you think. So the title of the sermon is The Greatest of All the Men of the East. And because of the time of the year, today is December 31st, 2022. So it's actually New Year's Eve day, and it's right after the time of year when people are thinking about these men from the East. So I think when I picked this sermon title, there were some thoughts. I think even Brother Rick thought, oh, this ought to be interesting. How are you going to address this? But it has nothing to do with the time of Christ's birth. We're actually going back to before he was born on the earth. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you to open to Job chapter 1. And in a cursory reading of Job chapter 1, you look at this, and I'll tell you, many, many years ago, before I believe many of the things that I do now, when I was actually studying in the church that I grew up in, I knew and understood I understood certain things, that Job was considered a very old book. In fact, even in the Bible that I'm using, it says Job is perhaps the earliest book of the Bible. It has a little blurb in here. And it tells you about the time that it was set. It was set in the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, that he likely lived at or before that time. They make that statement in my Bible. So sometimes you read those things and you just take it for granted. And I just say, well, yeah, that's good for me. I believe that. But, after the comment was made, I thought, yeah, I guess in the past I've said I don't always believe those things. People will say something, and I'll say, well, no, I don't believe necessarily what scholars say if there's no biblical proof. So I was really challenged. It's interesting how people will ask me a question, just like in times past, when somebody asks a question about, well, Jesus said that I will raise it up. And it stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, now I know better than that, but how do I know better than that? How do I know? And so when I was asked this question, I thought, I know that I've studied this before, but I couldn't call it to mind. And sometimes that happens. We can't always call things to mind. So I went back and I started from square one. And I started right here in Job chapter 1. So let's look at this. This is an account that we're all very familiar with. And as I read it, you're probably going to say, I don't see it. But I'm going to point it out to you. And it might be a little repetitious, but I want you to see some of these things. Beginning in verse 1, Job 1:1, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, And that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And seven sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. The King James, I believe, says the greatest of all the men of the East. And that's why I used that title. And verse 4, it continues, it says, and his sons would go and feast in their houses on each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. So what there tells me that Job existed at an earlier time than perhaps when Moses came to Mount Sinai. What proof do I have? Well, take a look. I want you to notice, how was his wealth measured? What do I mean by that? Look at verse 3. It says, also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. So this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Now, keep your finger here, but let's turn back. I didn't put this in the PowerPoint because I wanted you to use your own Bible to see how it's worded. Let's go to Genesis chapter 13, and I want you to notice how these men's wealth were measured. I want you to take a look. Genesis chapter 13 and verse 2, and I'm reading from the New King James. Oops, that's Exodus. That didn't look right to me. Here we go. Genesis chapter 13 and verse 2. It says, Abram, this is before he was Abraham, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. Now, when I looked at Job, I didn't see silver or gold mentioned. It only mentions his livestock. Well, why is that relevant? Well, let's take a look at another text. Genesis 24. Genesis 24. Notice verse 22. So it was, when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a golden nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrists, weighing 10 shekels of gold. So obviously there was monetary value to this gold. But let's look at verse 35, Genesis 24:35. It says, Jehovah has blessed my master greatly, and he has become great. He has given them flocks and herds. But it doesn't stop there. Silver and gold, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. What's the point? Well, in Job's day, there was no standard for gold. This came at a later time. This is known in history. The gold standard wasn't necessarily before this time of Abraham. And when we look and we see this, and you say, well, that's not very convincing. But stick with me. You see, in times of antiquity, gold was not used prior to Abraham's day. And we see the measure of wealth there for Abraham is measured with gold and silver, not just with his livestock. So Job, we see his wealth was measured according to his livestock. There were no gems used. Abraham's wealth was measured according to his livestock and the silver and gold. That's the point that I'm making. So also, take a look at Job chapter 1, verse 5, where we were just reading. Job chapter 1, it says, So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. I want you to notice another text, Job chapter 42. Job chapter 42. And we might consider more of this as, we'll see how time goes. Job chapter 42 and verse 7. It says, "And so it was, after Jehovah had spoken these words to Job, that Jehovah said to Eliphaz the Temanite, 'My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, and you have not spoken of me what is right. My servant Job has.'" Notice verse 8. "Now therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray over you, for I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me of what is right, as my servant Job has." What's the point? Job seems to have lived before there was an earthly sanctuary. There was no priesthood. There was no one to offer sacrifice. So what did he do? He had to offer the sacrifice. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Now, we're going to be doing a study on the sanctuary that Brother Rick and Sister Mary are going to be doing together on Monday nights. You will learn why this is so important. And if we understand the sanctuary, we realize that Job had to exist before the time of Moses, or before the time of the sanctuary service anyway. And it seems, according to the value that's put on his wealth, he lived before the time of Abraham, if not during the time of Abraham. But that's not all. Let's keep. It's amazing that we can find this just right here in the book of Job and comparing it to Genesis. Now, the other thing is, don't get lost in this word here in Job chapter 1. And, I looked at this very closely when I read it, because it talks about, in the New King James, it says in verse 5, "So it was when the days of feasting." It's not talking about feasts, as in the sanctuary feasts. It's not talking about that at all. It's simply talking about they came together for a meal, and they were gathered together there for a party. It could have been that this was some kind of an annual celebration as to like a day of birth, because it does mention there that it mentions here in this text that they would, they came together. What verse is it, Rick? 4. Thank you very much. And his sons would go and feast in their houses. Verse 4, Rick said. Thanks for that. Each on his appointed day, it says in the New King James. I don't know that it says appointed day in the King James.
It says in the King James, everyone his day.
His day. So it could have been that they'd come together. One of the children might have had a birthday. They might have come together to do that. We don't know. But an appointed day was a special day in their lives. This wasn't a feast day. So let's not get bogged down in that. This wasn't a festival. That Hebrew word is not chag, which indicates a feast day. This is a completely different word, which means that they came together for a meal and a celebratory type of event. So, there's another very important point that seems to place Job in a time prior to Moses, and that's the fact that he gave his daughters an inheritance among their brothers. Turn with me to Job chapter 42. We were just there. Job chapter 42, and I'll show you why I say that as we look at this. Job chapter 42 and verse 15. The very last part of the book of Job there. It says here, "In all the land were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers." Now, under the law of Moses, under the law that was given after the Ten Commandments were vocalized by God there at Mount Sinai, chapter 20 of Exodus that we covered last week, under the law of Moses, which came after that time, a father would pass his inheritance to the sons only, unless he had no sons. In fact, turn with me to Numbers chapter 27, and we can see this. We're going to look at a couple of places in the book of Numbers, and you'll see that this is the case. And then we're going to come back again, and we'll sound this down a little further. Numbers chapter 27. And I'm going to read several verses here just so you get the sense and the flavor of what's taking place. Beginning in verse 1, Numbers 27, verse 1. It says, "Then came the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, from the families of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, and these were the names of his daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses, before Eleazar the priest, and before the leaders and all the congregation, by the doorway of the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness, but he was not in the company of those who gathered together against Jehovah, in company with Korah, but he died in his own sin and had no sons. Why should the name of our father be removed from among his family because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. So Moses brought their case before Jehovah. And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, The daughters of Zelophehad speak what is right. You shall surely give them a possession of inheritance among their father's brothers, and cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them. You shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a man dies and has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the relative closest to him in his family, and he shall possess it. And it shall be to the children of Israel a statute of judgment, just as Jehovah commanded Moses." Now, we're in the book of Numbers. Let's go to Numbers chapter 36 to clarify this a little more. Numbers chapter 36, and let's start again. We're going to start in verse 1, and I'm going to read a number of verses here. Numbers 36, verse 1. Now the chief fathers of the families of the children of Gilead and the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, of the families of the sons of Joseph, came near and spoke before Moses and before the leaders, the chief fathers of the children of Israel. And they said, Jehovah commanded my lord Moses to give the land as an inheritance by lot to the children of Israel. And my lord was commanded by Jehovah to give the inheritance of our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. Now, if they are married to any of the sons of the other tribes, the children of Israel, then their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our fathers, and it will be added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So it will be taken from the lot of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee of the children of Israel comes, then their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So their inheritance will be taken away from the inheritance of the tribe of our fathers. Then Moses commanded the children of Israel, according to the word of Jehovah, saying, What the tribe of the sons of Joseph speaks is right. This is what Jehovah commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, Let them marry whom they think best, but they may marry only within the family of their father's tribe. So the inheritance of the children of Israel shall not change hands from tribe to tribe. For every one of the children of Israel shall keep the inheritance of the tribe of his fathers. And every daughter who possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the children of Israel shall be the wife of the one of the family of her father's tribe, so that the children of Israel may possess the inheritance of his fathers. Thus, no inheritance shall change hands from one tribe to another, but every tribe of the children of Israel shall keep its own inheritance. Just as Jehovah commanded, Moses did so did the daughters of Zelophehad. For Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah, the daughters of Zelophehad, were married to the sons of their father's brothers. They were married to the families of the children of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of their father's family. These are the commandments and the judgments which Jehovah commanded the children of Israel by the hand of Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, across from Jericho. So, as a righteous man, Job would have followed the law in obedience to God. You see, under the Mosaic law, a father passes inheritance only to his sons. Job didn't do that. He was considered a righteous man. If he had broken God's law, he wouldn't have been a righteous man. He would have been unrighteous. He wouldn't have been found righteous in the sight of God. The law, as this was written, this Mosaic law, was not yet given, though the Ten Commandments were. Keep in mind that the Mosaic law came into existence because of sin. The Ten Commandments existed before sin. This is really an important point. There's some other clues, though. We're still not done. Job's longevity seems to be a clue as to the fact that he lived at a different time, that he lived around the time of the patriarchs. You see, it was common for people who lived about the time of Job, it was common for them to live centuries. They lived a long time. The lifespan was shortened as time went on. If you've noticed in the Bible, if you've ever read through the account of Genesis, you see that the lifespan was shortened pretty short, particularly after the days of Noah. And most people typically lived around 100 or a little less from this time. But by adding up the years and following the facts, we find that Job lived to be probably about 200 years old, maybe even longer. We're going to look at some verses here in just a moment. We know in Job chapter 1, let's go back there, just to give you a little context for what I'm about to say. Let's see, here we go. Let me find Job again. In Job chapter 1, why am I not? Come on. There we go. I've got too many markers in my Bible, and it wants to pop open to these spots. Job chapter 1, beginning in verse 3 again, it says, also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. You see, he had to have time to marry and have at least 10 children by this time. So we don't know how old that could have been. Could he have had 10 children in 10 years? Did he get married at 20? Did he have them by 30? But remember that when he was meeting with the children here, when he went to sacrifice for them, they all had their own houses. So they were grown children. He lived long enough to have those 10 children, according to verse 2, 7 sons and 3 daughters. His children were old enough to have their own homes, as you see in verse 4, because they were in the house of one of the children. And then in verse 13, where we see now in Job 1:13, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house, so they had their own homes. And then after he lost everything, we probably should read the account. We might come back and get it here in a moment. But we know the account of Job, most of us do. And I think for the sake of some who may be tuning in for the first time, we'll look at this for a moment. But in Job chapter 42, if you turn there, take a look at what it says again. Job chapter 42. I know we're going from the beginning of Job to the end of Job a lot. Job chapter 42, beginning in verse 10, it says, And Jehovah restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, Jehovah gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then all his brothers and his sisters and all those who had been acquaintances before came to him and ate food with him in his house, and they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that Jehovah had brought upon him. That was their opinion, that Jehovah brought that. We'll cover that in a moment. Each one gave him a piece of, there you go, now this time, a piece of silver, and each a ring of gold. Now, Jehovah blessed the latter days of Job more than at his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen, for 1,000 female donkeys. He also had, what's it say? 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now, his kids were destroyed or killed earlier on. So by this time, now he has amassed double the wealth and 10 children once again. So it seemed that he had lived for a while. And if we look at verse 16, let's continue on here. in Job chapter, well, we can just continue where I was. It says in verse 14, and he called the name of the first Jemima, that was his daughter, and the second Keziah, and the name of the third Kiran-Hapuk. In all the land were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job. So this is saying, it seems that it's saying that they were women by this time. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. After this, Job lived, now this was after this. It says, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So he lived to be at least 140. But it's interesting, if you look at this, the Alexandrian Septuagint contains a footnote here in verse 16 that says, Job died at the age of 240. Isn't that interesting that they put that note there? So whether it's an assumption or not, I don't know by the ones who did the Septuagint. But we know he lived to be at least 140. And this is talking about after this time period. So even the age of Job seems to indicate that he lived much earlier than likely Moses did. Moses, even though in Deuteronomy it tells us that he died at 120, his eyes were bright and he died at 120, I find it interesting that Job lived twice as long, according to the Septuagint and the note that they put. But let's go back to Job chapter 1. We started there in Job chapter 1, verse 1. We read through verse 5, and we can see that Job was a man who was very successful. We saw how his wealth was measured by his not gold and silver, but by the things that he had a large family. And also when it talks about that he was the greatest of all the people of the East, I find it interesting that that particular word for East means all of the people of antiquity, which kind of places him at an earlier time than what they would consider Moses, if you look at that Hebrew word. So the word East means ancient, antiquity, very old. So there are a number of reasons why we would conclude, based on the things that we've talked about here, that Job is a pretty old book and that it was written at a time very likely prior to when the Mosaic Law was written. And even if it wasn't written then, the time period seems to indicate that it was a time period prior to that. So I'm glad that that question was asked, because it does. It makes you go back and say, wow, why did I say that? Was I basing it on information that I had heard before? Was it based on what my church had taught me or what another church had said and what Bible scholars seem to think? And I will tell you that the one quote that I gave you from the Septuagint, like I said, that's a footnote about the 240 years. I want to make that clear. But we know from the Bible account that Job lived to be he lived at least another 140 years after he had children. So we don't know how old he was, but it seems that that note in the Septuagint could be supported in some way by that. So it's always good when people ask those questions to go back and recheck, make sure, did I say something right? Did I get that wrong? Did I misunderstand it all of my life like I did the Sabbath? It's very possible. That can happen. It can happen. We might think we know something, and then we back up and say, wait a minute, I didn't know. But we've got a little bit of time, and I thought it might be good, since this came up in Sabbath school for a moment, I thought it might be good just to let's take a look at this account, because we were talking about how the topic came up, I don't remember how it was said, but that God kind of allows us to be tempted. And you'll see that here in the book of Job. So let's just begin in Job chapter 1. We've covered this many times, but it's a beautiful, beautiful thing when you look at it for what it really says. Verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Jehovah, and Satan also came among them. And Jehovah said to Satan, from where do you come? And Satan answered Jehovah and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. So let me ask you, when I look at this account and I see that this is taking place, where was this taking place? But this, where they were here, this meeting wasn't on the earth, was it? Because it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Jehovah, and Satan also comes. And God says, where do you come from? Well, I came from the earth. I'm here from the earth. This is a heavenly council, according to the way it reads. And verse 7, Jehovah said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered Jehovah and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. Then Jehovah said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth? That's taking place on earth, Job, and what he's doing. A blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. So Satan answered Jehovah and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, around all that he has on every side? And you have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. So Satan's saying, no wonder he serves you. Look at all the stuff you've done for him. You do that stuff, people will serve you if you do good things for them. But now, in verse 11, this is the devil talking to God. Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And what did Jehovah do? He said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan, here it is again, Satan went out from the presence of Jehovah. So obviously this meeting was a heavenly council taking place somewhere other than here. And they were talking about what was going on here. Notice that God didn't say, okay, I'll tempt him just to show you that he will serve me no matter what. It's not what he said. He said, look, you want to crack at Job? I'll pull some protection from him. Go ahead. Give it your best shot. But, what's he say? All that he has in verse 12 is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So even so, God still was protecting him. God didn't say I didn't put a hedge of protection around him, but he is saying I will remove that from him, but I'm still going to protect him. Don't you take his life. And verse 13, now there was a day when the sons and daughters, that's Job's sons and daughters, were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. A messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided and took them away, and they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. You notice who's getting the blame here? God is. Fire from God came down out of heaven and devoured them. Verse 17, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. Isn't it amazing how only one person gets away each time? While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house and fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone escaped to tell you. So let me ask you, these elements that are used here, it appears the fire from heaven could have been literal fire from heaven, but it could have been lightning. We don't know for sure. It doesn't tell us. But we see this wind that comes up and knocks down the building and takes the lives of the children. Did God do that? No. It's showing that the devil can have some kind of charge over the elements, whether temporary or not. He had some kind of power to generate this wind to knock that building down. You know, when I think of these weather patterns that happen and these hurricanes and these high winds and these tornadoes that are whipped up, remember, Satan and his demons have been cast to the earth, so they're wreaking all the havoc that they can. This is what they're doing. That's what was taking place here. God removed his protection. And friends, I think the closer that we get to the end of this world, And the more immoral that this world becomes, particularly the country of the United States, that's supposed to be built on Christian principles, and now they're allowing anything to go, what's going to happen? God's going to remove his protection. He can't protect people who are not doing his bidding. He won't do it. What a powerful lesson here. Now, God still protected Job. Was he affected? Absolutely, he was affected. But God had the devil spare him. Verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. And Jehovah gave, and Jehovah has taken away. Blessed be the name of Jehovah. And all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's pretty amazing. He misunderstood what was going on. He felt like God had put this on him. He didn't, see, we have insight because we're looking back on this account and we're seeing what the prophets wrote down for us, and we're saying there was a heavenly council, and we can look and say, wow, look at the faith of Job because of what he withstood. But at that time, according to him, the general consensus was if you had this stuff done to you, you've done something wrong. And as you read through the account of Job, you see this is what those comforters were telling him. What did you do wrong? You did something wrong because God's doing this to you. You know, according to the devil, what he did wrong was he was faithful to God. So now the devil wants to make him unfaithful. The devil tried the same tactics with Jesus. Let me tempt him and make him unfaithful. But it didn't work, did it? Thank God for that. Praise Jesus that he remained faithful to his Father. Chapter 2, we'll just read through this quickly. Again, so this didn't just happen once. Notice it says, again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Jehovah, and Satan came also among them to present himself before Jehovah. I want you to notice, in the context of this, is Satan a son of God? It says the sons of God came and Satan also came among them. It doesn't say that he's a son of God. At one time he was a son of God, but he's a fallen angel now. He's no longer a son of God in God's eyes. So he comes among them. And verse 2, and Jehovah said to Satan, from where do you come? Again, this must have been a heavenly council. Satan answered Jehovah and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. Then Jehovah said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. So Satan answered Jehovah and said, skin for skin. Yes, and all a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now. This is the devil talking to God. Stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And Jehovah said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. So God is still showing, we've been doing this whole series on love. What is this showing? The love of God. Don't you take his life. You spare him. So, verse 7, Satan went out from the presence of Jehovah and struck Job. Doesn't say God struck him. The devil did it. Struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So, we look at this account, and many times we'll look and we'll see what he said, what his wife said to him. And we think, wow, was she a godless woman? because she said, curse God and die? Let me ask you, was she suffering with Job? When the spouse suffers, if your husband or your wife suffer, you suffer with them. If your friend or loved one suffers, you suffer with them. She lost children. She lost everything she had, just as Job did. But you see, he didn't call her senseless. He says, you're speaking like one of those worldly, senseless women. That's basically what he's saying. He didn't say, you're a senseless woman. No, he didn't. He says, you're speaking like a senseless woman. Stop that. Really, he's saying, you know better than this. You know, if Adam would have taken that time with Eve, things may have turned out a little differently for humanity at that time. If he would have said, you know, you ate the fruit. That was senseless. I'm not going to do it. See, Job here had an opportunity. He could have cursed God and died, and his pain would have been over. But no, he held fast. Great lesson for us. When we think we're at the end of our rope. We think all is lost. We think that God's not paying attention. God was paying attention. We are paying attention. We're reading this account, and we're being bolstered by the faith of Job, by the courage of Job, by the things that he did. And it says, verse 9, his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. In other words, get it over with. I'd rather see you dead than suffering. When you have a dog that's suffering, what do? Or a pet that's suffering, you put it down. She would have rather seen him dead than suffering. He had these boils. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Notice he did not call her a foolish woman. But I've heard pastors say, he called her a foolish woman. No, he didn't. It's not what it says. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed? And then he counsels her, shall we only accept from God what good and not adversity? But what could they not see? They could not see that God said, go ahead, you're allowed to tempt him, but don't take his life. Wouldn't Satan have loved it if Job would have taken his own life? He would have loved that. But Job was faithful. In all this, it said, Job did not sin with his lips. What a valuable lesson. And as we read earlier, when we looked in the back, Job was blessed with more than he had before as a result of remaining faithful to God. And I found it interesting that it wasn't until he prayed for those comforters, it wasn't until he did that. He actually had to pray for them that God restored everything. What a difficult thing to do, to pray for somebody who is kind of mocking you and making accusations that you don't deserve. Those three so-called comforters. And God accepted Job's sacrifices, the things that he did in his prayer, to cause them to be able to be forgiven. So in a sense, he was sort of as a priest. In a sense, he was used in that capacity. And this, again, was before the priesthood existed. So even in Job, we can see sort of a type of Christ in the way that he remained faithful in the face of the devil. Accusations were made that simply weren't true. And that he actually prayed for the others who were persecuting him. Isn't that what Jesus did? Isn't that a beautiful thing? So, again, we see the same theme in the Old Testament. And what my understanding is that Job is one of the oldest books, the oldest book of the Bible. We see this type that we see in the New Testament of God trying to save his people and doing whatever he can to save them. And allowing them. You know, God had to allow Jesus, as we talked about two weeks ago. We talked about the fact that Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was being tempted by the devil that whole time. And he was fasting. It was the weakest he had probably felt physically until that time of his life. He had never felt as weak as he did then physically. When the devil came to Job, he was kicking him while he was down, so to speak. But Job remained faithful. what a beautiful account and what beautiful things we can find in the theme that the Bible gives us, which really, from the Old Testament to the New, from the beginning to the end, it's all about love and the restoration of what was lost in the Garden of Eden. And we can see those types throughout the Bible from start to finish. So we see why Job was called the greatest of all the men of the East, of all the men of antiquity. He was considered the greatest. But we would probably consider Jesus Christ the greatest man who ever lived on this earth, wouldn't we? So I find it interesting that we find the greatest of all the men of the East when it's referring to Job in the Old Testament. And then we know that Jesus is the greatest man who ever lived. Again, we see a type, God foreshadowing, trying to show us, point us to his Son, which ultimately gets us back to the Father. So I hope that when we look at accounts like this, that we learn more and more about the Father and the Son, about the love that God has for us in sending his Son. And you know, when somebody comes to you, if they ask you, or they might even, you know, this wasn't done in a belligerent way. I was asked, well, how can you say that? Just like, well, how do you know that Jesus didn't resurrect himself? He said, I will raise it up, right? It wasn't done in a belligerent way, but I had to stop. It makes you stammer a little bit. Don't be offended by that. Go back and look and say, why do I believe this? Know what you believe and why you believe it. And if you don't, then you're going on the coattails of what somebody has told you to believe. So many times we find somebody that we like or we listen to and, you know, oh, wow, I really like the way that pastor speaks. There are pastors that I look up to they're like mentors to me that I respect. But there are places where we part ways in our belief because I want to stick to what the Bible says. And this is what we have to do. We have to stick to the Word of God. Let it interpret itself. Don't follow men. Don't follow a church or an organization. Follow Christ. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through him. So be ready to make a defense for your faith. In fact, let's close with one verse. And it was the scripture reading that Brother Rick read earlier. Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. This is how we all should be. And I urge you to, if somebody challenges your faith or simply asks a question because they want clarity, don't be offended. Do what this is saying. Acts chapter 17, verse 11. Actually, let's begin in verse 10. It says, Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word of God with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. They searched them daily, every day. This is the attitude that we need. If somebody says something, just because you think they might have some authority or because you think, well, he knows what he's talking about or she knows what she's talking about, make sure. And allow people to ask those questions and to challenge you. Because if you go back to the scripture and you say, wow, for me, I didn't realize that the Sabbath was a day that God made in the beginning. I guess I'd read it, but it never occurred to me. Something that simple, it caused me to go back and re-examine everything that I had been taught, and I found that I was way off on a lot of things. And once that foundational truth was there, all of the building blocks go together. Once you have the foundational truth of the Father and his Son, the foundational truth of how long it took God to create the heavens and the earth, and the fact that he rested on the seventh day. And you find out the foundational truths about the lie that Satan told to Eve, you will not surely die. These are very foundational building blocks that we have to have in place. And once they're laid out, everything else fits. But because my understanding was skewed on all three of those issues, my foundation was faulty. And it was. I grew up with a faulty foundation on all three of those issues. All three of them. And it caused everything else to be out of whack. And then once they were lined up, all of these other pieces fit. And that's why when I went back to Job chapter 1 and I read through that, and I said, wait a minute. These are important facts here in these verses. And they were legitimate because we know about the sanctuary. We understand a heavenly sanctuary. We understand there was an earthly sanctuary. And understanding what those things mean, put all those pieces together. So keep studying your Bibles. Challenge yourself to let the Bible interpret itself. And in doing so, you'll be a Berean.